Hello, welcome to our Persian history video lecture series. Today we're going to be looking at the reign of Darius III, the last king of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the Macedonian military invasion, and the reasons for Persia's military collapse at the hands of Alexander the Great. Why does the Persian Empire fall so quickly after more than 2 centuries of existence? After decades of dominance through diplomatic influence over the Greek states around the northwestern frontier. Why does the Persian Empire suddenly succumb to this military challenge? They have faced invasions before. Artaxerxes II, back in 401, had repelled an invasion by the rebel prince Cyrus the Younger along a similar route from Anatolia to Babylon. The Persians had easily dealt with the Spartan threat of the 390s BCE, combining naval power with diplomatic pressure in Greece to raise up rebellions behind them and ultimately drive the Spartan invaders out. So what was so different in the 330s? Why was Darius III and his military establishment unable to cope with this new threat? Today we're going to start with the sources, think a little bit about how we know what we know on the era of Darius III and Alexander the Great. And then again, we're going to focus on a few of the strategic problems that play a role in the breakdown of Persia's military defense. In terms of sources, again, we have very little in the way of Persian evidence. There is one useful primary source, a Babylonian astronomical diary. That is a sort of calendar of observations of celestial movements that was kept on cuneiform tablets by priests in the Asa Gila Temple of Marduk in Babylon. We have a number of these diaries surviving for the late Achaemenid Empire and then the Hellenistic period that followed. And we're lucky to have a particular entry from the year 331 BCE. This is the year in which Alexander wins his third and most important victory over the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela. We're able to date that battle precisely to October 1st, 331, due to its exact dating in this Babylonian tablet. Unfortunately, the tablet, while it mentions political and military events, does so in a very brief form. It simply reports that there's a battle between the Persians and Alexander, that Alexander wins, and that the Persian armies scatter, and then it gives some information on the taking of Babylon by the Macedonians. So it's a useful primary document, but because of its narrow scope, and because we don't actually have these surviving for the other years of the earlier defense against Alexander's campaign, this limits what we can do with the primary source information. Our main sources on Alexander the Great are the so-called Alexander historians. And they pose us interesting challenges, and they're fun to work with despite their problems. On the positive side, we now have multiple sources that often conflict with one another. And we can actually compare and contrast. We can assess one account against another and think in terms of their relative plausibility and their relative access to accurate source information. We have 4 especially important Alexander historians. There's Diodorus Siculus, again the Greek writer writing a sort of universal history in around 50 BC. We have a Roman author writing in Latin named Curtius, possibly a member of the Roman Senate, maybe writing in the middle of the 1st century CE. There's the famous biographer Plutarch, who wrote a life of Alexander the Great, which was paired with his life of the Roman general Julius Caesar. And in the 2nd century CE, we have another Greek writing under Rome, actually a general and provincial administrator for the Romans, named Flavius Arrianus, often abbreviated to Arrian. He wrote a so-called Anabasis of Alexander, a march up country of Alexander, that gives the most detailed military narrative of the Macedonian conquests. I should also add we have an extra source. It's what's known as an epitome, a summary of an earlier history that is lost, kind of like ancient cliff notes, It's written by an author named Justin or Justinus, probably in the 3rd century CE, summing up an earlier Latin language history by an author named Pompeius Trogus. So these sources give us a lot of different accounts to work with. Sometimes there's a substantial correspondence between them, but at others, especially describing some of the military events, we see big discrepancies in the details. So this is fun for the historian, and in some ways it's more useful than having a single source, Herodotus or Thucydides, and nothing to compare against. On the other hand, none of them are primary sources. They are all full of multiple complex layers of bias and literary agenda. And they take very careful critical reading and unpacking, each in the author's own context, as well as in comparison with one another. They rarely cite their sources directly. We have some idea of the sources that some of them are using, but again, those sources would have had their own problems, and those earlier sources are now lost to us. We know that there were numerous historians who wrote at Alexander's court during his reign and during the wars of the successors that followed, and the establishment of Macedonian empires in Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. Those sources, some of them would have been writing at Alexander's instigation, or writing to glorify Alexander, or glorify themselves through their own personal association with Alexander. For example, Ptolemy, the man who founded a new dynasty taking over Egypt after Alexander's death, left a history of Alexander's campaigns that apparently was full of a great amount of self-glorification. Arrian, the later writer, uses Ptolemy as a major source, but he worries us as critical historians when he tells us the reason why. He says that I use Ptolemy along with another source called Aristobulus. Generally, when other writers disagree with Ptolemy, I tend to prefer Ptolemy's version. Why? Because he's a king. And it would be the most shameful thing of all for a king to tell a lie. Well, that can obviously raise eyebrows in this modern era. Maybe Darius the Great would have approved of the sentiment of kings avoiding the lie. But again, as historians, we have to be suspicious. So as a group, the Alexander historians are focused on the person of the Macedonian conqueror and trying to tease out his personality characteristics, trying to give a character portrait of this most famous individual of the ancient world. At various points, they're fairly uninterested in the Persian side of events. They don't necessarily have access to any genuine sort of Persian source information, except what's filtered through the Macedonian conquerors. So we are once again at the mercy of sources that we have to treat with a great deal of care. And when we use the Alexander historians for Persian history, they give an enormous amount of detail. They're actually very useful in describing the central and eastern provinces, which earlier aren't described in depth by Greek historians. We actually hear a lot about Bactria, Area, Erychosia, some of these eastern regions that are visited later on in Alexander's campaign that were important for the empire, but were not treated in particular detail by earlier narrative sources. But that being said, we always have to think about the Achaemenid imperial context and how Alexander's movements and behaviors fit into what we know about the workings of the Persian Empire. So let's think about the campaign. Let's think a little bit first about Darius III, the king who is in the unfortunate position of facing the Macedonian invasion. Artaxerxes III, who had recaptured Egypt for the Persian Empire in the late 340s, died in 338. The Babylonian chronicles simply report that he died. Greek sources claim that he was poisoned in a court conspiracy by a eunuch named Bagoas, but it's hard to know how much credence to give such a rumor. Artaxerxes III was briefly succeeded by a son, Artaxerxes IV, who was a minor and only lived 2 years before he too died. Again, according to the Greek sources, he too is done in by this scheming eunuch in the imperial court. Finally, this allows Darius III, who's probably the satrap of Armenia, to rise to the throne. Now, his rise is remarkable for an important reason. Darius III is the first king since Darius the Great, 200 years earlier, who is not a son of the previous ruler. The Achaemenids had enjoyed a long line of biological succession from father to son, watched over by Ahura Mazda. But in this particular case, the man who rises to the throne is a cousin from one of the other branches of the royal family. Darius III may have had a good reputation among the Persian elite. We know that he had some military experience. He's in his 40s at the time he comes to power. He already has a wife and an infant son, as well as 2 young daughters. When Darius comes to power, the sources claim that he outmaneuvers and eliminates Bagoas the eunuch, who was supposedly responsible for the deaths of the previous 2 kings. Supposedly, Bagoas thinks he can work through Darius, can't rule himself because he's not an Achaemenid family member, and tries to use Darius as a puppet, but Darius manages to outwit him and force him to drink his own cup of poison, Princess Bride style. Again, this may involve layers of folktale. We don't really know how much to trust on these sorts of stereotypical narratives of court intrigue. Darius III, though, comes to power at a situation when the empire is facing an external threat. Egypt is probably restive again. It's only been back in Persian control for a few years. Some sources suggest that there's a short-lived Egyptian rebellion. There may be a pharaoh proclaimed, a man named Kababash, who shows up in a few brief Egyptian records. We think that Darius III may have campaigned to Egypt right at the beginning of his reign and put this rebellion down. However, the greater threat is growing in the northwest, where the king of Macedonia, Philip II, has managed to spend the last couple of decades taking over the Greek world, outwitting, allying against, finally overwhelming one Greek opponent after another, and forcing all of the Greek cities, except for Sparta, into a Greek alliance called the League of Corinth. In order to try to unify the Greek world behind Macedonian rule, Philip II suggests that the Macedonians will lead the Greeks in a invasion of the Persian Empire, designed to pay Persia back for the invasion of Xerxes 150 years before. This is historically ironic, as the Macedonians had fought on the Persian side in Xerxes' invasion. But Philip is making a bid for Greek unity, trying to portray this as a sort of new Trojan War, with Greeks united against foreign barbarians across the sea. We don't know how far Philip intends to go. Of course, he does not end up getting to lead the invasion in person. He trains the army, prepares the invasion, sends advance forces to land near Troy in Persian territory in 336. But before he can go himself to take personal charge, Philip is assassinated. And this brings his 20-year-old son, Alexander III, to the throne. Alexander crosses into Asia, landing near Troy in 334. He assembles a large invasion army, probably more than 40,000 men. This may be similar in size to the army that Cyrus the Younger had when he invaded the center of the empire 70 years before. Now, Alexander has some disadvantages when he and his Macedonians move into the Persian Empire. They do have an excellent army that is full of veteran military professionals, well paid, well trained, with excellent weaponry, including long pikes for their infantry, a cavalry force, and a siege train with the best and latest catapult models. However, Alexander is, according to some sources, low on money when he moves into the Persian Empire. His army is costly, requires a continuing salary for upkeep. There's always the question of the loyalty of Greece. Alexander recognizes that Greece is subject to Macedonian power. He has to leave troops behind in order to guard against the danger of Greek revolts. Alexander also is relatively weak in naval power. He puts together a navy, but it's going to be outnumbered by Persia's Mediterranean fleet. It contains a large number of Athenian ships whose loyalty is potentially questionable. And so when we think about this campaign, we can compare it and contrast it with the Spartan invasion of Asia Minor back in the 390s. What's different? How do the Macedonians find themselves in a stronger position than the Spartans do? And why do the Persians react less effectively in the 330s than they do in the 390s? Well, the first key event is the Battle of the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia in the spring of 334. This is the first major battle, fought just a few weeks after Alexander's landing in Anatolia. Alexander himself famously leads the Macedonians in person against an army of Persian satrapal contingents. There are multiple satraps present with their troops and some mercenaries. There's also a Greek mercenary general on the Persian side named Memnon of Rhodes, whom the Alexander sources credit with giving good advice that the Persian generals ignore. Supposedly Memnon doesn't want to fight. He knows how strong the Macedonian army is. He advocates a scorched earth defense and a retreat into Persian territory, but he's shot down by the arrogant Persian commanders. Again, this falls into the story pattern we've already seen in some of Diodorus's descriptions of Persian wars in Egypt. We have to be suspicious of Greek historians' attempts to cast the Greek military figure as the only intelligent one in the room. And there are probably good reasons, if Memnon advocated the plan that he did, for Darius's satraps to be leery about carrying it out. They have a new king in charge, and they have to think about their political position. Do they keep their offices under a new monarch? Satraps are serving at the pleasure of the king. And how well are they going to be able to keep their jobs if, as soon as they're confronted with the enemy whom the king has ordered them to stop, they retreat and allow Persian territory to be burned? Back in the 390s, the Spartans had effectively ravaged Persian territory in Anatolia, and according to the Greek accounts, that had partly been responsible for the execution of the satrap of Sardis, Tissaphernes, by the Persian king. Doubtlessly, Tissaphernes' fate is remembered by later Persian generations, and administrators have to wonder whether it's safe for them to simply let the invader walk further and further into Persian territory. Memnon himself is portrayed in the sources as someone who knows the right military moves to make, but is suspected by other Persians because he's a Greek. But again, this is probably a simplification by the late sources. Memnon, in fact, is a Greek mercenary who has intermarried with local Persian nobility, who has marriage alliances with the satrapal family of Daskylion, and therefore, in some ways, is a lot closer to the Persian mindset than the late Greek sources might have us think. Now, the Battle of the Granicus matters because of its aftermath. The ancient accounts of the battle focus on Alexander's personal heroics, charging across a river with his cavalry, personally dueling Persian generals, coming within an inch of death, but managing to live and slaughtering his opponents. The emphasis in the sources is very much a Homeric one. Alexander as the new Achilles, having a glorious triumph over barbarian opponents. However, Alexander came close to dying, and again, we should remember that some of what happens with the Persian plan at the Granicus is simple bad luck. Alexander just barely manages not to get killed, and several Persian generals who are engaged in the same kinds of heroics on their side do get killed. And that has consequences for the administrative network in Persian Anatolia. Immediately after the Battle of the Granicus, the Persian command network in Anatolia is effectively decapitated. The satrap of Sardis had been killed in the battle, and the satrap of Daskylium survived but committed suicide immediately after the battle out of shame at the Macedonian defeat. Several other regional administrators die as well. And basically it seems that the whole top tier of Persian command and control in Anatolia is wiped out. In the aftermath, Alexander raced towards Sardis while sending part of his army towards Daskylium. And these two key satrapal centers both surrender to the Macedonians rather than resisting in a siege. That's crucial because Alexander gets Achaemenid stockpiles, food supplies, and money. And this means that his army can continue to build on their initial victories, exploit them, and move further into Achaemenid territory. Now, Alexander's next move is to move down the coast. Essentially, he tries to capture Ionian Greek ports that are still on the Persian side. Some of them come over to him voluntarily. Others, like Miletus, which always ends up on the wrong side, Alexander takes by siege. He takes the city of Halicarnassus, a little further south, the old hometown of Herodotus. The idea is to deprive the Persian navy of bases, to prevent it from being able to strike back against him in the Aegean Sea. Now here, Alexander does have some weaknesses that play against him. His navy is outnumbered by the Persian fleet that comes into the Aegean. And to avoid a repeat of the Spartan disaster at the Battle of Cnidus, Alexander dismisses his own navy, demobilizes it, and sends the ships home, because he thinks a naval defeat would be more demoralizing and more likely to spark revolt back in Greece. Now, with a free hand in the Aegean Sea, the Persian fleet is not really harmed by the loss of a few coastal ports. It simply moves out to the islands. And in 333, the Persian fleet, led by Memnon and by his Persian nephew, Pharnabazus the Younger, moves into the Aegean Sea. It starts capturing Greek islands back, ensuring that they're going to remain out of Macedonian rule and autonomous under the old terms of the king's peace. The Persians start preparing for the idea that they might send money and mercenaries to those Greeks who are willing to rise up against the Macedonians. Ultimately, Alexander has to reconstitute an Aegean fleet belatedly to try to check some of the Persian naval advances in 333, and they temporarily take back some of the Ionian ports. So, what's the difference here between the Persian response in the 330s and the Persian response in the 390s? In both cases, they attempt to use naval power and diplomatic influence over Greeks in order to undermine an invader who's doing well by land. But there are some key differences. Unlike the earlier Spartan invasion of Anatolia, Alexander can take cities. The Spartan land offensive had been limited because it didn't take a single satrapal center. It didn't take stockpiles. It didn't get those caches of money. It remained underfunded and undersupplied. In the Aegean, the Persian fleet is dominant in 333, but in mainland Greece, there's far less open anti-Macedonian resistance than there had been anti-Spartan resistance in the 390s. The situation in Greece is far less amenable to a Persian intervention that would cause enough trouble to cancel the invasion. The Persians do encourage Sparta to rise up against Macedonia in 333. They managed to get some money to a Spartan king who starts hiring mercenaries in 332, but it takes a long time. It doesn't actually bear fruit until 331, when Sparta rises up virtually alone in Greece. Athens and other Greeks refuse to help it, and the Macedonians crush the Spartan rebels. The ultimate factor, though, that cripples the Persian naval efforts in 333 is the Persian land-based counterattack that leads to the Battle of Issus. King Darius III, faced with the news of these disasters in the west, decides that he will mobilize a royal army at Babylon, then he'll move it up the Euphrates to Syria, and finally cross down to the Mediterranean coast. And his idea is that he will succeed as the king, he will show off his royal prestige where his satraps have failed. He will defeat the upstart invader. Now, as we all know, he doesn't. The Battle of Issus starts well for the Persians. They outmaneuver Alexander and get behind his army, force him to turn and fight with his line of communications and supply cut. But Alexander's tactical genius and the success of his veteran soldiers in battle makes all of that null and void. Alexander wins a smashing victory over Darius III at the Battle of Issus in the fall of 333. And the key factor there in the further disintegration of Darius's image and Persian fortunes is the loss of the royal family. Why does the king bring his elderly mother, his wife, his teenage daughters, his child son to the battlefield? Why does the entire royal family come to Issus and fall into Macedonian hands? This is one of the great questions of the collapse of the empire. Darius has been criticized, obviously, by historians ancient and modern, for exposing his family to harm and thus giving Alexander the ultimate propaganda coup. However, there may have been good reasons for this. It's probably a show of confidence in one way. You have a royal progress. The royal household, as it did in centuries past, travels through the empire to show off royal prestige, wealth, and generosity to their assembled subjects. Bringing along the royal family is a statement of Achaemenid confidence, a statement that they have nothing to fear from these invaders. A series of catastrophic mistakes, though, put the royal family in the path of a Macedonian army that breaks through the Persian lines too quickly and overruns the royal camp too quickly, making their evacuation impossible. And I would argue that this fundamentally cripples Darius's image. The king, who not only seems to have lost the divine favor that guarantees victory, but who can't protect his own family, is in a weakened position as a protector of the empire. Now, ultimately, Issus is a disaster for the Persians. Darius takes a year and a half to reconstitute another army that could have a chance of fighting the Macedonians again. And he has to give up essentially all of the western coastal possessions of Persia as a result. Alexander takes Phoenicia, besieging the city of Tyre and accepting the surrender of other cities. He takes Gaza in Palestine by siege. Egypt surrenders without any serious fighting. The final military disaster that seals the fate of the empire comes at Gaugamela on October 1st, 331. And there, Alexander's army on the plains of northern Iraq outmaneuvers and outfights the Persian army. As you'll see in the readings, the Alexander sources give accounts of the fighting at Gaugamela that differ in a lot of the tactical details. It was a large, confusing battle with large amounts of cavalry action. Several sources refer to giant dust clouds that obscure the vision of the troops. But again, Alexander's superiority in maneuver and in the training of his troops seem to have played a decisive part. Although the Persians try to surround his army on the wings, Alexander's men hold together. He leads a charge that breaks through the Persian center, and Darius himself is forced to retreat. Now, Gaugamela was decisive because it led to the fall of Babylon. After the Battle of Gaugamela, again, this is in northern Mesopotamia, Darius himself fled east through the mountains to Media. And Alexander, instead of chasing him, turned south and marched 300 miles to the empire's first city. Babylon is heavily fortified. In theory, it could have defended itself in a siege. Presumably Darius hoped that it would buy him time to raise more defenses in the Zagros Mountains. But instead, Babylon starts a trend of surrenders by Persian strongholds, in which the surviving satraps attempt to keep their administrative positions and wealth by defecting to the Macedonian side. Just as Babylon had surrendered so quickly to Cyrus the Great, marking the Persian Empire's beginning in 539 BCE. Its surrender by the Persian general Mazaeus without a fight in the fall of 331 cements the loss of the western half of the Persian Empire to the Macedonian conquerors.